Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So some breaking news, Josh Warrington has vacated his IBF featherweight title. Essentially reason being, it makes fights with Can Xu or Gary Russell Jr. a lot easier to make. According to this report on Boxing Scene, the IBF actually refused to sanction Josh Warrington versus Can Xu as a unification fight. Josh Warrington versus Can Xu has a working date of April 24th. It looks like Can Xu is going to be elevated to full WBA champion. So providing Josh Warrington can get that fight, you know, he could be fighting for the WBA title sooner rather than later. His promoter Eddie Hearn said the following on the issue: "It's so important for Josh to be in a mega fight after Lara on February 13th. He has his heart set on the ring belt, and it's up to us to make the Can or Russell fights for April or early May. I've been working hard with Robert Diaz of Golden Boy close to Xu, and have also had several conversations with Louis de Cubas regarding a Gary Russell Jr. bout. Both fights are fight of the year contenders." Josh Warrington also had his say on the matter. "It's disappointing we couldn't have the IBF title on the line, but I can't let those decisions stand in the way of me going down in British boxing history by facing the very best in the division. I've always dreamt about winning the ring belt. For me it leaves no doubt who the king of the division is. Right now, my mind and focus is on Lara for February 13th, and then I'm looking to pick up that beautiful red and blue belt, which of course is the ring belt." Those are the words of Josh Warrington. All in all, how do I feel about this? Well, really, it all depends on what happens after Maurizio Lara. If they can get one of those two proposed fights, either Gary Russell Jr. for the WBC title and maybe the ring title, or obviously Can Xu for the WBA title or maybe the ring title, if he can get one of those two fights after Maurizio Lara, then this decision to vacate the IBF, in my opinion, really isn't all that big of a deal. However, if he can't get one of those fights, what are his options? Josh Warrington without a title is a less attractive opponent for the other top guys in the featherweight division. So yeah, if he can't get Can Xu or Gary Russell Jr., then Josh Warrington might have put himself in a bit of a spot, really. You know, me personally, ideally, I would have rather seen Josh Warrington keep the IBF title and fight his mandatory Kid Galahad. I know the first fight was terrible, but let's be honest, it really wasn't conclusive. Instead of fighting Maurizio Lara, I would have much rather seen Josh Warrington fight Kid Galahad again, right that wrong, because it was a real close fight, beat Kid Galahad, and then chase that unification fight. Now I'm assuming that the IBF weren't willing to sanction Can Xu as a unification, because Kid Galahad is still the mandatory. I'm assuming that's what the hold-up was. So for me, why not just fight the guy, beat him, and then move on to those unifications? That's what I would have rather have seen. And quite frankly, if Josh Warrington can't get one of these big fights, and he's left without a belt, it almost looks like a bit of a duck. So the pressure is really on Eddie Hearn to make one of these big fights for Josh Warrington. You know, I want to see those fights, and if those fights do happen, I'm not going to hold it against Josh Warrington, but he has put himself in a precarious position here, in my opinion, and it's a shame. Ideally, we love to see unification fights. We would love to see the IBF title on the line if Josh Warrington were to fight Gary Russell Jr. or Can Xu in an ideal world, but as we know, boxing's not ideal. Ultimately, while I like to see unification fights and obviously undisputed fights, the main thing for me is the quality of the fight. And, you know, Josh Warrington versus Gary Russell Jr. is a quality fight, as is Warrington versus Can Xu. If those fights can happen, again, I won't hold anything against Josh Warrington. But what this does do, it does put Kid Galahad in a real good spot, because obviously he's mandatory right now. And if you look at the IBF rankings in the featherweight division, after Kid Galahad, the next best ranked opponent is James Jazza Dickens. So obviously that fight would be easy to make. Jazza Dickens is with MTK, Kid Galahad with Eddie Hearn. Those guys have worked together numerous times in the past. It's a domestic clash, an all-British world title fight, and a rematch of our original fight, which took place back in September 2013. Kid Galahad won that fight by a late stoppage, but that fight actually was really competitive. Quite a good fight actually, from what I remember. So these two guys could be having a rematch for the vacant IBF featherweight title. Quite frankly, I actually think this has worked out quite well for Kid Galahad because he's number one contender, he's mandatory, and when you look at the top 5 rankings, I don't think there's anyone there that beats Kid Galahad. Jazza Dickens, Mark Magseo, Andoni Gago, I don't see any of these guys beating Kid Galahad, so I fully expect to see Kid Galahad lift the IBF title when he fights for it, given the rankings right now in the IBF. But there we go. Share your thoughts below. Are you disappointed by this news? Listen, part of me is disappointed because, again, we love to see unification fights. It puts the cherry on the top. But if we still get these fights with Gary Russell Jr. or Cans Yu, then honestly, I'm not all that bothered about it. But what are your thoughts? Share your thoughts below. It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.